So back in the 90s, as we all know, General Abrams Sr., when he was the Chief of Staff of the Army, came out of the Vietnam War and decided, I can't change policy, but how can I influence policy? Well, I'll change the force structure to make sure that if we have an extended land campaign, that we will not be able to sustain that without the reserve components, so we can make sure that those citizen soldiers from our great Army National Guard and our Army Reserve will continue to have and mobilize the communities from which they come from, and that'll provide better support to the effort. Fast forward to the 90s, the 32nd Chief of Staff of the Army, General Sullivan, and I'm grateful for General Sullivan's mentorship. For some reason, he adopted me right from day one when I got in this job, maybe because I'm the 32nd Chief of the Army Reserve, so we share the same number. He changed the force structure again. And what he did is he put most of the combat support and combat service support in your Army in Compo 3, the Army Reserve. So specifically, what does that mean? Well, most of the technical capability we have in the Army as it relates to life-saving and life-sustaining capabilities, which is a phrase that I use to describe the Army Reserve, as you heard in the video, is in your Army Reserve. Things that require advanced technical degrees. So for good or for bad, I'd argue for good, 94% of all the lawyers are in the Army Reserve. Some would say that's bad. Most of the doctors and nurses are not in the Army, regular Army, they're in the Army Reserve. 80% of all the logisticians, almost all the conventional civil affairs, the only full spectrum engineering in any service is in the Army Reserve. That's for theater engineer commands. So again, whether it's sustainment, whether it's satellite, whether it's communications, if we go to the area of cyber, I've got 3,600 cyber folks who work for Microsoft and Google in their private sector in their civilian lives, and then another 3,600 that are in support. Whatever that technical capability is, most of that capability is in the Army Reserve. And because the force structures changed in the 90s by General Sullivan, the Army now must rely on the Army Reserve de facto to be part of the operating force, because they do not have that capability in Compo 1 or in our great Compo 2, the National Guard. Almost all the theater opening and closing capability is in the Army Reserve. So it gets to the point about strategic versus operational reserve component. So it doesn't matter how we define operational reserve. What it does matter is the Army can't execute a mission anywhere around the world today without the Army Reserve because of the force structure changes that were made in the 90s. Period. That's just the way it is. And so we have to be part of that operating force, or at least, and we have to be at a higher level of readiness, or at least a portion of the command and the component has to be at a higher level of readiness to meet those demands. Now, a big discussion is how much of the Army Reserve must be operational. Is it a third? Is it something less than a third when we look at those early entry set the theater capabilities? And when you look at the operational functional units that must be the first in to provide that CSS and combat support, and then you talk about the ONF, operational and functional, that supports and trains them, as well as our training commands and our partnership with First Army, it ends up being almost a third of the Army Reserve must be ready all the time. And what I'm talking about here is at a level of readiness at a C3 plus. I can't say C2 because I think it's pretty hard for a reserve unit to get to C2 level prior to the mobilization. But the bottom line is when they get to the mob site, they have to be in and out within weeks, not months, or the Army will fail a mission. When we look at defense at home, Title 10 has the responsibility for defend the homeland. And so we've got our great first responders, the police and firemen, and our National Guard to reinforce that. But Defense of the Homeland is a Title 10 mission, and the Army Reserve is a Title 10 force, and we work for the Army 24/7. So as the Chief of the Army Reserve, I work directly for the Secretary and the Chief, and as the Commanding General for Army Reserve Command, I report directly to the FORCECOM Commander. And I don't know if it's good or bad, I'm on my 4th FORCECOM Commander in 4 years, and I think I'm on my 3rd Army staff. So the message that I'm taking away from that is I need to go. And so again, I'll be doing that in a few weeks. But when I talk about the force structure and the importance of readiness, we can't afford not to have the Army Reserve ready. So how do we build readiness? I look at readiness and how to build readiness in two ways. So I'm a capitalist, I'm a private sector guy, I'm a citizen soldier who came back from the private sector, back on active duty, and I, to be frank, as I tell members of the Congress, I don't apologize for being a capitalist and being a private sector guy. So I said, well, if my plan to generate readiness in the Army Reserve only has a government approach, that's probably not a good plan because of the Budget Control Act and sequestration and dwindling resources. And I need to recognize that my stakeholders are the private sector. Now, what do I mean by that? Most of the Army Reserve are citizen soldiers. They live in the communities, like our great National Guard, but they work in the private sector. And so the Army Reserve, in my opinion, is the most directly connected to the private sector of any component or service in the Department of Defense. And so I thought, how can I leverage those relationships with the private sector? Now, I'll get a little bit outside strategic issues right now for a minute. When I lecture as an academic and I talk about global threats to the world, I think about it a little differently than maybe some of the military. I think of climate change. I think of security or lack thereof. I think of migration. I think of poverty. I think of pollution. And when I look at these global security challenges, as I define them, governments of the world can't solve those problems. It will take the private sector in partnership with governments to solve that. So going back to readiness in the Army Reserve, we had this great employers partnership program that Jack Stoltz, my predecessor, created, and it became so successful that it was replicated through all the services and components. At OSD, we now call that Heroes to Hire. So I said, how can we take that and make it more than an employers partnership program? So the first thing I did is said, we're going to call it the Private-Public Partnership Office. Private first, because we're going to emphasize our connections to the private sector. And Aaron Thiede, who's with us today, is the director of the Private-Public Partnership Office. And what we've done is we've leveraged those relationships with over 7,000 firms. So if you can think of any Fortune 500 firm you might be familiar with, they're probably already a member of the Private-Public Partnership of the Army Reserve, as well as startup companies. And they do everything from certainly provide opportunities for our soldiers and their family members to get employment, but they also directly generate readiness by participating with us in supporting training exercises. And I'll give a few examples of that. We look at in Samoa, and we might go in a Title X training status and construct a building. It's a training mission where we're executing a deliverable in support of General Vince Brooks at USAPAC. But then our General Electric's partner will come in and resource it with equipment, and then along with our Army Reserve soldiers, we will come in and train, with our medical expertise, train them how to use those facilities to offer and improve the quality of medical care on the island. I could give you thousands of examples of the Army Reserve partnering with the private sector every day that helps our readiness, and believe it or not, it helps their bottom line. Now, whether they're focused on corporate social responsibility or other things, the bottom line is whether it's ESPN, whether it's Coca-Cola, regardless of who the private sector partner is, we can find a way to partner with them and improve our readiness while we deliver support to ASCCs and combatant commands. And here's the beauty of it. It doesn't cost the Department of Defense a dime, because I already have to spend money to train those Title X soldiers. And so that's one way how we generate readiness, the private sector. The public sector way is plan, prepare, provide, which you heard in the video. And so whether we're talking the old way of generating readiness with ARC4Gen or the new model called SRM, it's still, from the Army Reserve perspective, it's plan, prepare, provide over what is a 5-year model, a progressive readiness model, where in that 5th year, you have to be available and ready to execute contingent or combat missions around the world. So the idea is, starting with the plan piece, how could the Army Reserve, which is a global command, it's the largest 3-star command in the Department of Defense, and it's a big critter, to use a technical term. It's the largest command in the Army, short of Forces Command, and Forces Command is the largest command only because USARC is part of it. It's a big organization. And why is it important? It's the only component of the Army that's a command. And it is because we are a command that we can respond so quickly. So when General Brooks says, hey, I need an LSV launched in the water tomorrow to support 25th Infantry Division because maybe there's a crisis in the Philippines and we need some contingency operations, it doesn't need to go to the Pentagon. They call the commander of the Army Reserve Command, and I order the execution, and the LSVs are launched the same day. That's the responsiveness of mission command. And that gives us a significant advantage because we're not tied to a state boundary. We're always Title 10. We always work for the Army. And so as part of that plan piece, I said, how can we improve our support to ASCCs and COCOMs? We created Army Reserve engagement teams and cells, which I will argue between the private-public partnership and Army Reserve engagement cells and teams will probably be the two things that I will be remembered for, either positively or negatively. And what we did is we said, how can we grow structure inside ASCCs or combatant commands without growing the overall Army Reserve structure and pay for it within Army Reserve, no cost to the Department of Army, that improves that support. And so at our geographic combatant commands, we have Army Reserve engagement teams at the command headquarters, and then I have a one-star leading an Army Reserve engagement cell, which is a fairly large cell at the ASCC, and they are the one-stop shop to all things Army Reserve, and they are linked directly back to USARC, which of course owns all the assets. The impact this has had around ASCCs and COCOMs has been phenomenal. Every year, so I do business a little bit different. Every year, when I do travel, and I travel a lot, I spend most of my time, sadly, not meeting with soldiers, but meeting with combatant commanders. I meet with the customer. I meet with combatant commanders and ASC commanders first and foremost. Then I meet with Army Reserve units and soldiers and leaderships. And then I meet with the private sector to see how we can formulate our relationships. And the impact we've seen not only in our readiness, but our ability to respond to all the combatant commands through Army Reserve engagement cells and teams has been phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And I think that, which is the heart and soul of our plan piece, and I'll just describe it just a little bit more. So you've got a one-star, seasoned one-star general at the Army Reserve engagement cells, and we even are putting one, an AREC at USASOC, because when Charlie Cleveland commanded USASOC, he said, hey, Jeff, remember me? I said, of course I remember you. We have tremendous support to SOCOM. He goes, I'm an ASCC too. I want one of those. Well, initially I wasn't going to give Charlie one, but I started thinking about it, and then General Votell and I talked about it. I thought, they do need one, but they needed to structure it a little bit. We'll put a little more emphasis down at the TSOCs, where we have an AREC minus at the TSOCs, and then my ARECs at the geographic commands, then we'll link, and it'll actually provide connection between the ASCCs with the conventional forces and our special operators. Because what did special operators need? They need what I got. They need engineers and doctors and lawyers, and when I talk to combatant commanders, that's what they want, because they want to prevent and shape their AOR using CS and CSS. And they want small teams on the ground, less than 30 days. They want what I got. When I talk to governors, they want what I got. When I talk to TAGs, they want what I want. And they want what the Army Reserve has. And so our plan piece has really helped tremendously as it reinforces regional line forces. The prepare piece is just training, good, old-fashioned training focused on all three components and the joint force. And we're doing that pretty well, but we couldn't do it without the great support of First Army. And I want to mention First Army not just because my battle buddy Mick's here, but because there's a debate. It wasn't a debate too long ago. There's a big debate. Do we need First Army? Let's get rid of First Army. And and some of the Army Reserve folks that maybe aren't drinking the right Kool-Aid, which recognize how important First Army is, here's our chance to get rid of First Army. Bad plan, Ranger. We need First Army to help us train, because we cannot get the level of readiness we need to the left of mobilization. My personal opinion is I might be able to get some small units to C2 to the left of MOB, specific legal units, very small specialty units, but collectively you just can't do it. You don't have enough training time. So I need that mobilization. I need First Army to come to the left of the MOB to help me with leader development, to help me organize that important collective training. And so our prepare piece is doing just that. And whether we're doing CSTXs or WARXs, we're integrated into the CTCs, and we are seeing tremendous generation in our readiness. And then, of course, the provide piece is making sure we're providing. But providing is not just the way we think of providing forces normally, which is a deployment order to support a combat mission, a named operation, or a contingent mission. It might be ODTs. It might be sending units that I've prepared, but now they're in the available year. Well, we have to use that readiness that we've generated. Otherwise, it hurts my recruiting, my retention. And some of the ways I can do that is through ODTs, Overseas Deployments for Training. I can send them to Africa to support AFRICOM. I can send them to Europe to support EUCOM. And so Plan, Prepare, Provide allows us to use that government approach of generating the readiness, sustaining it, and executing it in partnership with the private-public partnership, which helps them both in their citizen life, but also in their military life. And I think those are two of the most important things that I've done in the 4 years. And to be frank, I still sit back in amazement. Army Reserve engagement cells and teams is a fantastic idea and wonderful in terms of how it's being executed. What a hard sell it was. You know, it was a tremendous hard sell because no one believed me. You know, what do you mean it's not going to cost me anything? It's not. General O and I remember having this conversation with General O in front of his fireplace. And I had all the ASCCs and all the COCOM saying, hey, General Odierno, let Talley start assigning the AREC directors. And he still wasn't quite sure. And I said, sir, you need to fire me or trust me. And since I live across the street, I'm going to keep coming to your front door every day until you fire me or agree to allow me to make the assignments. And in a way that only General O can do is kind of gave me the look. I thought the bear was going to come out, but it didn't. And he said, you know, what I like about you, Jeff, is you're pretty aggressive. I said, yeah, not bad for a reserve guy, huh, sir? I said, when you get out of the Army, you go to the private sector, you're going to realize you got to be pretty aggressive out there, too. And so he finally said, okay, I don't want to see you every day, so go ahead, I'll prove it. So sometimes, however you get results, but since then, it's been amazing the impact that we've had. And I'm grateful for all the great leaders in the Army Reserve and what we've done, not only through Plan, Prepare, Provide, but our private-public partnership. Some other points that I want to mention is I'm very grateful to the great work the Commission has done to help frame an important discussion about where the Army is and where the Army needs to go. And often in our Army, there's some squabbles within the family. And I'll just be frank, the Army Reserve brand is very high on the Hill, it's very high in the building, and it's very high across the combatant commands and ASCCs. And so often we're a broker, to be frank, between brother and sister, Compo 1 and Compo 2, because I believe the Army Reserve understands Compo 1 probably better than Compo 2. And I believe that we understand Compo 2 probably than most people in Compo 1. So often I am abdicating and mediating between Compo 1 and Compo 2 in meetings, whether it was with General Odierno or others. And in fact, I got a kick out of NAGAS. I think somebody nominated me to be an honorary member of NAGAS because they said I was doing so much great work for the National Guard. I also took some heat rounds for it, sometimes from the Army staff. But the Commission has helped frame this discussion to allow us to really do what we must do for America, which is to have one Army and to gain efficiencies as well as continue to be effective. And there's goodness in having the three components because there are three different ways of focusing and organizing. And I look at our principal mission is to serve the regular Army. And I tell Army reservists, anytime you forget that we exist to serve the regular Army, you probably need to leave because that is why we have an Army Reserve. And within that readiness issue that I talked about, as you know, General Milley talks about his #1 priority and there's no other #1 than readiness. That's actually what I wrote when I wrote Rally Point. And so Rally Point is what I wrote before, the day I came into command, I wrote Rally Point. General O liked it so much, he kind of plagiarized it, and Waypoint was his name, that he came out with his. So anytime, someone plagiarizes, of course, really it was flattery, because as a recovering academic, plagiarism's bad, don't plagiarize. But in this case, it was okay. So he copied and used Rally Point, and then between Rally Point 32 and 32.1, which is said the readiness is the #1 priority, you'll see the emphasis on some of the things that I've been talking about. So if you want to see more of this, you can just Google Rally Point and Rally Point 32.1, and it'll give you some of the details of some of the great things that we're doing to generate readiness. A couple of points that I want to get to that hopefully stimulate some conversation is, let's talk about resourcing. We're faring pretty well amongst the three components in the Army in terms of resourcing, but I do have some concerns. One concern that I have every day is full-time manning. So the Army, and these are my opinions and my thoughts, so I'm not necessarily speaking for the Army, so if you want to throw a tomato, you throw it at me, don't throw it at our great Army. The Army is like a startup company. It has a cash flow problem. And the cash flow problem is, as we know, they have an operating budget that has relied on additional funding for years, OCO, and now that additional funding has gone away, but the requirements haven't gone away. In fact, the requirements have gone up. I think, I don't know what the current stat is, it's probably close to this. If we look at the demand signal that's coming into the Pentagon for the Army as a service from combatant commands, it's about 60% of all the requirements that come in to the Pentagon are for the Army. And yet our resourcing is going down, but our demand signal is going up. Okay? So that's good. That's good that we're a service in demand. But the challenge is, how do you generate that readiness? So as everything's got to get squeezed down to the base budget, there are those folks who are looking at how do you do that. And some want to trim or cut full-time manning because they don't see the correlation between readiness and full-time manning. And so for those that don't know what full-time manning is, and forgive me because I know most of you do, but most of our organizations are pure reserve organizations that have monthly battle assemblies and a couple weeks of annual training. And so the basic funding that I get from Congress that comes to me in the Army Reserve is the same statutory funding since World War II. It's 2 weeks of annual training and a monthly battle assembly. 39 training days a year. That's it. Anything above that is it's a plus up for op-tempo. Well, you have to have more than that to generate the level of readiness, at least for part of the force that I described earlier that must be ready to support the operating force because of their early entry, set the theater stages, or some of the important DISCA missions that we're doing. And so, but yet going back, let's say I'm in PA&E or I'm a G8 Bubba in the Pentagon. It's not personal, and I always remind people in DC, don't take it personal, even if it is, okay? They've got to find a way to squeeze the budget. So they say, hey, what's the biggest pot of money that we can look at from the reserve components? And it's full-time manning. Because through no fault of their own, they don't understand how those few soldiers and MilTechs, civilians, basically keep the doors open and the lights on and facilitate anything that we do. They are they basically are the foundation for individual readiness, and without individual readiness, hopefully we would all agree that you can't have leader readiness and you can't have collective readiness. And so they want to cut that FTS. Well, the Army Reserve's at 13% full-time manning. The average for the reserve component is 19.4. I'm at 13%. 20% of that 13% are what we call above the line. That means the Army has said we're going to take, because the Army can do this, because I work for the Army, and the Army could say, Jeff, you're going to reassign 1,500 soldiers to USAREC to help the Army recruiting because we're having a recruiting problem. So the analogy that I've used, which some people don't like, is let's say we're all commanding the 82nd Airborne Division. Huh? Because my commanding general office is Fort Bragg, all the way, center of the universe, right? Fort Bragg, North Carolina. You're now commanding the 82nd, and the Corps says, hey, Division Commander, chop 2,000 soldiers over to 25th Infantry Division, climb to glory for a special mission. Roger that. 5 years later, you ain't got them back. Tropic Lightning's got a special mission. 82nd, chop another 2,000. Roger that, all the way. 5 years later, you ain't got them back. That's what's happened to the Army Reserve. As we have done a great job supporting our total Army, and they've ordered me to reassign assets, they do such a great job, I can't get them back. And so 20% of that 13% are above the line, not generating readiness in the Army Reserve, but generating readiness in the Army and the total force and the joint force. Now, the Army Reserve is big as all the other Federal Reserve combined. We're about the size of the Marine Corps minus the Marine Force Reserve. It's a big organization. And so I can't trim 13% any less. And so my message is to the Pentagon and on the Hill is I need to increase FTS, from 76%, which is what we're currently authorized. I really need to get it to 85%. So let me put it in terms of USR. We have mostly military in here. So unit status report, of course, is one thing the Army gets right, provided we report accurately on how we generate readiness. So I'm a P4 in terms of personnel readiness and full-time manning in my Army Reserve units. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out if you're a P4, although occasionally I'll get a commander who says, well, I'm a P2 and I'm a P3, I'm a T2, but I'm a P4. I don't know how that works, so we question that assessment and then go back and talk to the commander. But I need to get it to a P2. One of the ways to do that, if you don't want to plus up my FTS, which Congress wants to do, is plus it up with Title 11. Bring back some regular Army soldiers into our formations to get me up to the 85%, which would be a P2. And then that helps with our total Army policy. It helps generate readiness. It's good cross-pollination. It's great for Compo 1. It's a wonderful way of doing business. Everybody likes that idea. The question is, can we make it happen? The other point I want to get to before I run out of time is equipping and modernization. So pre-9/11, the Army Reserve had about 6% of the equipping modernization budget. I'm less than 3% today. How can that be, Jeff? You just told us how you're de facto part of the operating force, and we're relying on you in all these theaters, but your equipping modernization budget is less than half of what it was before 9/11? Yes, that's correct. And if we didn't get NAGRIA, thank God for support from the Congress on NAGRIA, we would really be in bad shape. We're falling behind the other two components in equipping modernization. That's important when you look at mission command systems. I need to be able to plug and play and communicate with our National Guard and our regular Army, and I can't because 75% of all of our mission command systems aren't interoperable because of lack of modernization. Whether it's a hardware, software, it's actually a combination of both. So those are two of the concerns. Now the good news is the Army staff gets it. I'm on the Army staff. So my peers get it, the chief gets it, and people are working hard to try to help us resolve some of those challenges. But hopefully there's a lot of other things that I didn't cover that we can get into, I hope, in Q&A as long as we have. But I want to leave on a positive note, at least with my formal remarks, and that is we have the best Army Reserve we've ever had in the history of the United States. It's absolutely true. The quality of our leaders, the quality of our soldiers, our involvements in the community, the level of our readiness is wonderful. However, our readiness is going down. And this is something I kind of question, I challenge the Army on. How can you tell Congress that readiness is being affected, but you're not showing it in your reports, yet your resources is going down? Well, I can show there is a correlation. My resources is going down, and as you might expect, there is a correlation in a decreased readiness. Not that there's a direct correlation. More money doesn't always attribute to higher readiness. But the good news is we're still able to execute missions, but what keeps me up at night is when I have to deliver that early entry set the theater capability, and I can't afford to have First Army fix it and spend 3 months at the MOB site. I've got to get them out in 30 days because they need to be somewhere where it's pre-designated. And I can't do that if I can't get them at a higher level of readiness. And so those are some of the concerns I have. And as I close, I know we have something good when the Army and the Joint Force tell me how much they value and appreciate the support from the Army Reserve. I know the National Guard appreciates all the cooperation and support we give them. And when I look at other nations that are allies, it's very telling. They're all growing their reserve components, and they're using the Army Reserve of the United States as the business model. Whether the United Kingdom, who just renamed Territory Guard after the Army Reserve, and I met with their Chief of Staff recently. Also, I met with the Chief of Staff of the Korean Army. So when your allies are renaming their reserve components and redesigning after the Army Reserve, I think that's an indicator that you're probably doing something right. And it's not because of me. It's because of many of the great leaders that are out here in your Army Reserve. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my formal comments, and hopefully we can get into great discussion. So as our tradition in the Army Reserve, our motto is twice a citizen, and of course we always say, Army strong. Who wants to be first?
I got a question for you. It relates to two or three things that you said. First one was about all those people that are out in industry who are Army Reserve soldiers. obviously industry, especially leading edge industries, can take the time, the talent away from you if they have better salaries, better, shouldn't say better, more challenging training, and they're there all the time. Is that a problem for you, especially in places like the cyber world? And then I have one other question after that.
Okay, so great question, Roger. Did everybody hear the question?
No.
Okay, so the question was, I'll paraphrase. I used to do this as a teacher, in the classroom to make sure I get the question right. So I think what Roger said was, hey, are you having trouble retaining people in the Army Reserve because of their talent? There might be more effort to recruit them permanently into the private sector where they may not have the additional time to spend in the reserve components. And are you seeing any? Are you seeing that impact in the Army Reserve? And the short answer is we are seeing an impact. The impact is positive because of P3O. What we find is, first off, we want to make sure you're in the right job, and so sometimes what we'll do is use our P3O because we want you to have a great career in the private sector, not just a job. And so what we do is partner and affiliate with organizations that value the armed forces and the skill sets that we have. And so we're actually seeing just the opposite, that they recognize that when they hire an Army Reserve soldier, they get someone that is loyal, team-oriented, physically fit, good leadership skills, and is going to be frank, outperform the other employees of their organization, and will stay long-term. And therefore, they're willing to share that person with the Army Reserve, and the P3O effort we talk about has helped. And so we're actually seeing just the opposite. We're not having, in terms of careers, we're not having a problem. We're actually seeing more positive support from the private sector. And you mentioned the issue of cyber, especially in cyber, because often they bring a different viewpoint from the cyber warrior perspective in the military to that private company. But an example would be a couple of years ago there was at Lincoln Labs. Lincoln Labs is a laboratory that is really a subsidiary of MIT. It's outside of Boston. And there was a warrior exercise designer on cyber ops that had the reserve component folks against active component folks. And this was at a time in our Army where, I'll just be frank, the Guard and I were having to argue pretty hard to the Army why we're relevant in cyber. And not everybody was buying it initially. And then we had the demonstration. And the reserve guys, National Guard and Army Reserve, just kicked the snot out of Compo 1 in the competition. Why? Because they were writing code in their head because they worked for Microsoft and Google in the private sector. And so the technical competence wasn't even close. Wasn't even close. Then the lights went on and the regular Army said, you know what, we think there's probably a role for the Guard and Reserve in cyber. So we have to, first and foremost, we have to continue to demonstrate why we are technically at the top of our game because of our private sector employment and how we can execute that and deliver that in a Department of Defense fashion. And I think we do that regularly, and that's why our stock is high. You said you had a second question, or do you we want to move on to
No, I'd like to find out who else has questions, please. Comments? Then I do have one more. The 39 days issue that you talked about, it can be taken a lot of different ways. Do you need more days? You need rules, laws, policy change to get more days to do what you have to do?
Well, I think the short answer, the question is, do you need more training days? I think the short answer is, not for everybody, but for that portion of the force that I must have at a higher level of readiness, and I'm going to define those as set the theater early entry forces, I must have more training days to generate higher levels of readiness, or the Army will fail in a mission. Notice I said the Army. So we have to plus them up with op-tempo money, and I don't want to get too much into the budget weeds, but I'm going to need more RPA, more OMAR, and that's the real challenge. I don't necessarily think we absolutely across the entire Army Reserve want to say it's no longer 39 training days, it's 45, but there are certain units that will need more training time, and I need to have access to money that would allow me to execute ADOS, active duty for training, ADT, whether it's RC or AC, to provide that training. So the short answer is I do need more training days, but I don't need it for the entire force. So this is a debate. If you start resourcing too much, then the reserve becomes no longer a reserve. It becomes something other than the reserve. And then there's that balance between how far do you go before you lose the support of the private sector, their employers, and their families. On the other hand, if they become truly strategic across the board, which no one wants, today's soldiers, I would argue, in the Guard and the Reserve won't stay, because that's not why they came into the Reserve component. And so there's a balance there, but I do need more resourcing. And I communicate that to the chief and the secretary, a hard number. I'm very specific as an engineer, tell them exactly what I need. And I know the chief's looking at that, but we have to have more training days for, I'm going to say, a portion of the Army Reserve, about a third. That's probably a little on the high side, maybe a little less than, at least 25, somewhere, and I don't want to give the number here in this setting. I can talk to you privately about it because we have the number. But I do need more resourcing for those early entry set the theater forces. And I'm being careful how I generate readiness, because I don't want the perception of the Army Reserve to be, well, we have and have not units. Because every unit, so what I have to remind everybody is everybody is at a low level of readiness to the left of the plan, prepare, provide. And as you move in that progressive readiness model, which we call SRM, we improve the readiness. And so I don't want people to say, well, I don't want to go to this unit or this unit because they're kind of a second-class unit in terms of how we're perceived and how we're resourcing. And so we're managing that readiness very carefully. And the way I do it, if I have an O&F guy or gal that start getting a little bit too critical of TNS, training support, as the chief, I just I reassign them to a TNS unit for professional development. And their attitude changes pretty quick. And I do the reverse. I take TNS people that are homesteading and TRADOC assignments, and I say, Ranger, it's time for you to get your rucksack, you're going to O&F land. And as long as we keep that, and we got to do the same thing. That's why we need that cross-pollination with Compo 1 and Compo 2. And that's why, going back to the FTS piece, that would help.
Thank you.
Okay? Any other comments or questions? Everybody's sleeping, or now their hands are going up. Can I go Mike first? Franklin, I saw your hand. These aren't ringers. I haven't talked to you guys.
Just a quick question. You've talked a lot about the Army, and that's what the discussion has been focused on. But can you address the Army and Army Reserve role supporting the joint force?
Well, I can in a number of ways. So let me start at the homeland, and then go there. So in the homeland, ASCCs are supposed to be the one-stop shop for all things conventional Army, which is why I'm got my ARECs embedded in the ASCCs. So when we look at Army North, I have a two-star command, the 76th Regional Operational Readiness Command, that is aligned with them, and they own all the EPLOs, Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officers. So you may not know what an EPLO is, but the Army Reserve provides 100% of all the EPLOs to FEMA from the Army, and over half of them, all the EPLOs from the Department of Defense. Why is that important? Because in the event of any disaster in the homeland, the first responders are not the armed forces. And so when FEMA and other agencies get involved, it is the Army Reserve representing the Army and DOD that's right there, and also integrated with Army North in support of NORTHCOM. And so that's a clear, specific way that we're basically leading on the behalf of the Army support of the homeland, whether it's DISCA or other functions. When we get outside, it's the same thing. I can give examples in every combatant command. Probably the clearest one would be if let me go over to AFRICOM for a minute. So when we look at AFRICOM, I was having a conversation with General Rodriguez about this, and we started talking about what sort of prevent and shape missions would you like executed in your AOR. And then we talked about some of these, and we came up with one of them was focused on water and water security. Well, the biggest employer in Africa is Coca-Cola. We spent about $260 million, maybe $300 million on water projects in the last 5 years. So the Army Reserve, because of our relationship in the private sector, we can broker a deal, if you will, to do a project or a training mission that is directly affecting prevent and shape activities that the combatant commander want, that are attractive to the State Department, who we also have a integrated relationship with, and that is predominantly paid for by the private sector, where we're just providing Title X support. everybody wins, and the Army Reserve is bringing those different agencies, if you will, the Department of Defense and the State Department together as we're preventing, shaping, and hopefully making the AOR more secure and stable. And so those are just two quick examples. Does that answer your question, Mike? Because I know Franklin had a question, and I don't know how much time we've got, but I've got all the time that one more question, I think, is what I'm being told. So, Franklin, do you want to?
Sir, I just wanted to maybe highlight how the Army Reserve would support in a defense support to civilian authorities, maybe a vignette of how we can support. So it's not very well understood after the NDAA.
Sure. So, the Army Reserve, I'll criticize this a little bit. We don't tell our story very well. I'd argue the Army doesn't tell our story very well. Guard does a great job of telling their story. And I married into a Marine family, so I can say this about the Marine Corps. Semper Fi is, you got one Marine out there, there's 5 press releases. And I'm not picking on the Marines because I love the Marines, but we just don't tell our story well. So every day the Army Reserve is out there saving people on Mount Rainier. We're doing all the great stuff the Guard's doing because normally the Guards asked us to come in and help them. But we don't get the publicity because, to be frank, we just don't. Our culture is not. We don't have the resources to focus on that. But going back to DISCA, so an example would be I'm talking to a governor who used to be a senator in the state of West Virginia, and he said, so if we have a problem in my state, who's the tag for the Army Reserve? I am, sir. Okay, so you can send Army Reserve forces from in West Virginia to help? Yes, sir. What authority do you need? None. I'm the commander. Can you get other resources? Yeah, I could send forces from all the neighboring states. Well, who do you got to talk to for that? The tag of the Army Reserve for those states? No, I'm the tag for all 50 states and the globe. One-stop shopping. And then they started getting interested. And I said, so I don't want to compete with the Guard, but we can be there to support our Guard brothers and sisters. And so what came out of that is At a Glance. And a friend of mine who just retired from the Guard not too long ago was a 2-star. Scott Gorski and I were in 4th ID together, and I said, how do we come up with something to help members and their staffs understand the Army Reserve and to help tags and governors? And came up with At a Glance, which we update every year, probably, in my opinion, the best document we've produced in the Army Reserve during my tenure. And I'd encourage you to get a copy or to Google it and look at it. And it tells you what we have in every state and territory to include the economic impact in that state and territory. It's got contact information for private-public partnership, our Army Reserve ambassadors, Fort Family, which General Milley and Miss Milley love. This is our virtual family programs that is fabulous, fabulous. And this is an award-winning document. If you don't remember anything else about this morning, At a Glance and Fort Family. It's all you got to Google. And you'll be amazed at the ability to quickly educate and inform you on how you can access the Army Reserve, whether you're a CEO in a company or whether you're part of our Department of Defense, no matter what, private or public or academic. These two things really, really help. And so I don't know if that's where you want me to go with that, Franklin, but I would be remiss if I didn't. And I think that's going to be it for this morning. I'll stick around and answer questions or comments until the staff tells me I have to be somewhere else. I will give up command on the 1st of June at Fort Bragg, and then General Milley will retire me a few weeks later on the 17th of June at Fort Myer. As all good citizen soldiers, I come on active duty to meet the needs of the Army, and then I leave when my mission's done. My mission's done. It's time for me to leave and return to the private sector. So God bless. Thank all of you.
Well, thanks, General Talley. Thank you very much for your insights, and I would extend a personal thanks for your absence of PowerPoint. I think that was deeply appreciated. The one request I would ask you to consider, I think if I wrote it down right, 94% of the Army's lawyers are in the Army Reserve. If you could take a couple more That would be deeply appreciated, I think, by many others, to be sure. But you've given us a lot to think about in the role of the Army Reserve in providing operational capability to the Army, but also providing the needed strategic depth that is so desperately required. And then lastly, it's kind of bad form to criticize the speaker, but I'm gonna. You said that you think you will be most remembered for two specific programs, the private-public partnership and the Army Reserve engagement cells. I think you're wrong. I think you will be remembered for generations for your love of soldiers, your love of soldiering, your commitment to the Army, the commitment to the nation, and the cohort of Army soldiers and leaders who have benefited by your personal model of living and abiding by the Army's values. All of us who have had the privilege of serving alongside you and knowing you have benefited, and you have made us all better, and I think that's what you will be remembered for. Thank Esterline Defense and especially Pete Fuller, who's here representing them for our sponsor this morning. We thank you very much. These sessions like this simply are not possible without such sponsorship, and we are deeply appreciative of that. The next AUSA one-day hot topic series is on Army Force Projection and Sustainment. It'll be held here on the 2nd of June here at the Conference and Events Center. Please see the AUSA website. Those things do, in fact, tend to fill up pretty quickly, so register early. The next breakfast here, similar to this one, will be on the 10th of May here at the Conference and Events Center, and we'll hear from the Army's Vice Chief of Staff, General Dan Allen, well known to this audience, and certainly always looking forward to the Vice Chief's comments. A number of other fora that AUSA is sponsoring: the Land Pack Symposium and Exposition out in Hawaii on 24 through 26 May. A great agenda working with General Brooks and his team, Admiral Harris, the PACOM commander, many others, international military leaders in industry will be there as well. We encourage your participation, and frankly, it's in Hawaii, so that's not so bad. And then lastly, the international trade shows that AUSA participates in very significantly. One just wrapping up today in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The SOFEX in Amman, Jordan in May, and Eurosatory in Paris in June, all great events. Roger Thompson and his team can provide the details in addition to those on the website. So again, General Talley, thank you once again for a great morning. We thank you for your service and wish you well. And on behalf of AUSA, know that you will always have a home here, and we look forward to our continuing association, partnership, and relationship with you as you move to the next adventures in your life with the gratitude and thanks of all of the Army and all of our nation. Thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful day.
No.
Yeah.